Python removal is nothing new here in the Sunshine State, from the work of Florida Fish and Wildlife to the annual Python Challenge. But now the state has teamed up with another partner, helping achieve record-setting removal numbers in the Everglades.
On a quiet Tuesday morning, wildlife technician Marcus Reyes leaned out of a low-flying helicopter over the Everglades. In his hands, a canvas bag filled with dead mice. One by one, he started tossing them into the trees below. Not randomly, not carelessly. Each mouse had been prepared with precision, stuffed with a substance and fitted with a small cardboard streamer, so it would snag in the branches instead of falling to the ground. Inside the aircraft, specialized cartridges held hundreds of these baits. "This is one of the bait cartridges," he explained. "Each magazine carries about 900, and we've got 4 on board. That's 3,600 drops before we even need to reload." It might sound unhinged at first, but this wasn't some rogue experiment. This was a controlled, government-backed operation. And the substance hidden inside those mice? It's something you probably already have at home. Scientists are now considering deploying millions of these across the Everglades. The target isn't birds. It's not alligators. It's something far more elusive, the Burmese python. And strangely enough, the reason this might actually work is the most unexpected part of the entire story. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are what shattered confidence in every traditional solution. Since 2017, more than 10,000 Burmese pythons have been removed from Florida's wild. Sounds impressive, until you look closer. The annual Python Action Team competitions bring in hundreds of skilled hunters, yet each event typically removes only 100 to 200 snakes. Government crews work year-round. Private hunters patrol levees at night with headlamps, sometimes grabbing snakes with bare hands. And still, it's not enough. On average, it takes around 12 combined labor hours just to capture a single python. That's a massive investment of time and manpower for very little return. The truth is, nobody knows exactly how many pythons are out there. Estimates range from tens of thousands to numbers officials rarely say out loud. What experts do agree on is this: the population is growing faster than it's being reduced. A single female can lay up to 100 eggs in one clutch, and these snakes are nearly impossible to detect. Hidden in dense sawgrass, blending into the environment, they don't act like prey. They move like shadows. Burmese pythons likely entered Florida through the exotic pet trade, bought small, manageable at first, then released when they became too large to handle. And too large happens quickly. What starts as a 2-foot curiosity can grow into a 16-foot, 165-pound apex predator capable of swallowing deer whole. That's not an exaggeration. Scientists have recovered entire deer, hooves, antlers, everything, from inside python stomachs. The ecological impact has been devastating. In some parts of the Everglades, raccoon populations have dropped by 90%. Opossums, rabbits, wading birds. Many have seen similar declines. For the python, every encounter comes down to one simple question: can this fit inside me? And the Everglades provides the perfect answer. Warm climate, endless water, dense vegetation. No real winter. It's essentially ideal python habitat, far from their native Southeast Asia. Here's the problem. Every standard method hits the same wall. You can't hunt what you can't see. You can't trap a predator that doesn't need bait. And you can't poison a water system without harming everything in it. So researchers began thinking differently. What if, instead of chasing the predator, you turned its food into the weapon? To understand how that idea took shape, you have to travel nearly 8,000 miles away, to Guam. Back in 1952, a brown tree snake accidentally arrived on the island, likely hidden in military cargo. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. It wasn't particularly aggressive, only mildly venomous, and easy to overlook. But the ecosystem it entered was completely unprepared. Guam's native birds had evolved without ground predators. They nested low, laid eggs in exposed areas, and had no instinct to flee from something approaching on the ground. Fear of snakes simply didn't exist. For the brown tree snake, this wasn't a challenge. It was an open buffet. By the time scientists realized what was happening, it was already spiraling out of control. Dr. Julie Savage arrived in Guam in the early 1980s to investigate the disappearing bird populations. Early explanations blamed disease or chemicals, but then she began finding destroyed nests, eggs clearly taken by snakes. She later recalled the moment everything became clear. She stood in a forest that should have been alive with sound, but there was nothing, no birds, just silence. Then she spotted a brown tree snake near her feet. That was the moment it all clicked. Her research, published in 1987, stunned the scientific world. But by then, it was too late to stop the collapse. Snake populations reached densities of up to 5,000 per square mile, 12 bird species. A stopped reproducing entirely. 8 more declined by over 90%. Cultural traditions tied to those birds, songs, stories, ceremonies, vanished alongside them. In less than 4 decades, Guam's forests fell silent. And the damage didn't stop there. These snakes climbed everything, including power infrastructure. Mistaking cables for branches, they caused roughly 200 electrical outages every year. The economic losses reached millions, not even counting the ecological damage caused by losing key species like pollinators and seed dispersers. Savage's work didn't just expose a disaster, it triggered a desperate search for a solution. And that search led to something almost unbelievable. Acetaminophen, the same ingredient in everyday painkillers, is deadly to these snakes. A relatively small dose is enough to shut down their system entirely because their bodies can't process it. So, researchers got creative. They placed the compound inside dead mice, attached lightweight streamers so the bait would lodge in the treetops, and dropped them from helicopters. It sounds strange, but it worked. Field tests in Guam during the 2000s showed dramatic results. Early trials dropped a few thousand baited mice into targeted areas, and snake populations dropped by around 80% in those zones. Later operations scaled up to tens of thousands of drops, covering large forest regions. Compared to traditional methods, it was simpler, cheaper, and far more effective. Then came the twist. Scientists discovered that Burmese pythons share the same vulnerability. The same compound, found in the common painkillers, affects them in a similar way, which raised the obvious question, why not use this method in Florida? The answer lies in a detail most people overlook. Adult pythons are too large. A fully grown snake isn't interested in mice. It hunts much bigger prey. A small bait wouldn't even register. But younger pythons? That's a different story. Juveniles, especially in their first couple of years, are the perfect target. At that stage, they actively hunt small rodents, and unlike adults, they spend time climbing through vegetation. Researchers like Dr. Kristen Hart have tracked these young snakes closely. Using radio transmitters, she's observed how they move, constantly exploring, climbing, searching. They're active, curious, always on the move, she explained. If food is in those trees, they'll find it. That behavior is the key. The bait isn't meant for the giants. It's designed for the next generation. And that's where the strategy becomes powerful. You don't need to eliminate every adult snake. You just need to stop enough juveniles from surviving long enough to reproduce. If that happens consistently, the population begins to collapse over time. It's not about today's snakes. It's about preventing tomorrow's. But scaling this idea to the Everglades is a massive challenge. Covering that landscape would require millions of bait drops, repeated again and again across seasons. And there's one major problem. Once you release that many toxic baits into an ecosystem as complex as the Everglades, you lose control over what else might eat them. And that's where this story takes a much darker turn. To cover all of South Florida's python territory, scientists aren't talking about dropping a few thousand baited mice. They're talking about millions. Not once, but several times every year. The scale of what Marcus Reyes was preparing for that morning over Alligator Alley is almost impossible to wrap your head around. But here's the problem. The moment you release millions of acetaminophen-filled mice into one of the most biologically rich ecosystems in North America, you lose control over what eats them. And that's where this stops looking like a clean solution and starts looking like a massive ecological gamble. Because the Everglades is not Guam. By the time aerial baiting began in Guam, much of the native bird population was already gone. The ecosystem had already collapsed. At that point, the strategy wasn't about preservation. It was damage control in a system that had already broken. The Everglades is a completely different story. It still supports around 350 species of birds, 60 types of reptiles, 40 mammals, and roughly 50 species of fish. It's not a damage system. It's one of the most intricate and interconnected environments on the continent. And acetaminophen doesn't just affect pythons. Start with animals that are already barely holding on. Raccoons and opossums in parts of the Everglades have already declined by about 90% because of python predation. These animals naturally feed on rodents. To them, a dead mouse isn't suspicious. It's an easy meal. Now imagine what happens next. A species already pushed to the brink by one invasive predator suddenly faces a second threat, from the very method designed to control that predator. This isn't just an added risk. It's a compounding pressure that could push already struggling populations past the point of recovery. And it doesn't stop there. Let's say a squirrel eats one of these poison mice but doesn't die immediately. The toxin remains in its body. Later, an owl hunts that squirrel. Now you have secondary poisoning. That owl might then carry the contaminated prey back to its nest. And here's the critical part. Young birds are far more vulnerable than adults. What doesn't kill the parent could wipe out the chicks. This kind of chain reaction can ripple through the entire food web at once. And once it starts, it's almost impossible to monitor or contain. Every species in the Everglades is part of a delicate system. Remove one piece and you don't always know what else will collapse with it. Even birds of prey, like owls, red-tailed hawks, and bald eagles, aren't completely safe. They don't typically rely on carrion, but they will take an easy meal if they find one, especially when food is scarce. For an adult raptor, a single poison mouse might not be immediately fatal, but they don't just feed themselves, they feed their young. And nestlings are far more sensitive. If contaminated prey makes its way into nests, you could see entire breeding seasons fail. Empty nests, no chicks. A silent loss that might only become visible months later when surveys show missing generations. But when scientists ran full risk models, something even more alarming showed up. The species at greatest risk wasn't a bird, it was a big cat, the Florida panther. Current estimates suggest there are only about 120 left in the wild. That's it. A species that once roamed across the entire southeastern United States has now been reduced to a tiny population, confined to a narrow stretch of habitat in southern Florida, surrounded by highways, development, and the Everglades itself, the very place where these bait drops would happen. Wildlife biologist Daryl Land has spent over 30 years tracking these animals. He knows many of them individually through radio collar data. We've lost panthers to cars, disease, and fights, he's explained. The population can take some losses, but not many. There's no safety margin here. And here's where it gets even more concerning. For cats, acetaminophen is extremely dangerous. Their bodies lack the enzymes needed to safely break it down. Even small amounts can trigger severe reactions. Destruction of red blood cells, followed by liver failure. A dose that might only sicken a raccoon could easily kill a panther. Now, think about behavior. Panthers are apex predators. They hunt deer and wild hogs. But like most predators, they don't pass up an easy opportunity. A dead mouse lying in the grass? No struggle, no energy spent. It's free food. And panthers are curious. They investigate unfamiliar scents. They scavenge when the opportunity is there, which means they wouldn't ignore these baited mice. They would check them. And that's where the risk becomes real. Panthers move through exactly the kind of terrain where these bait drops would happen, along the edges of water, weaving through dense vegetation, right at that boundary where swamp meets sawgrass. Now, picture this. It's dusk. A Florida panther, one of maybe 120 left alive, moves silently through the brush. It catches a scent. Looks up. There's a dead mouse snagged in a low branch. It takes 3 seconds to eat it, and walks away. Already dying, without any sign, without any warning. Biologist Daryl Land has run that scenario through his mind more than once. The numbers are terrifying, he's said. You can't release millions of anything into panther habitat and assume they won't come into contact with it. These cats roam huge territories. Avoiding the bait isn't realistic. It's inevitable they'd encounter it. and every official risk assessment reaches the same conclusion. This method cannot be used in or near active panther territory without a serious chance of pushing an already endangered species closer to extinction. The problem? Python territory and panther territory almost completely overlap in South Florida. The solution and the problem exist in the exact same space, but the panther isn't the only species that complicates this. There's another snake, one most people have never even heard of. That might be one of the most important animals in Florida right now, the eastern indigo snake. It's the longest native snake in North America, and one of the very few predators that actively hunts juvenile Burmese pythons. It doesn't avoid them. It tracks them, kills them, and eats them. In other words, it's nature's built-in control system, and it's disappearing. Decades of habitat loss have pushed indigo snake populations into decline, to the point where expensive conservation programs are trying to rebuild their numbers through captive breeding and reintroduction. Here's the problem no one talks about. Indigo snakes eat mice. If millions of poison bait mice are released into the Everglades, the very species that could naturally help control pythons would be directly exposed. And here's the worst part. We don't even know how they'd react to acetaminophen. No one has tested it. The risk isn't theoretical. It's real, and it's completely unmeasured. But it doesn't stop there. Aerial bait drops aren't precise. A significant number of those mice won't land neatly in trees. They'll end up in the water. And that matters, because Burmese pythons are semi-aquatic. They live near marshes, lakes, and slow-moving rivers. That's exactly where these drops would be concentrated. So, what happens when the bait hits the water? Fish eat it. Now the toxin enters the aquatic food chain, spreading in ways that are almost impossible to track or contain. And it's not just fish. Native snakes, like eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and water snakes, would also come across these baited mice. While they may not be as critically endangered as the indigo snake, they're still part of a system already under stress. At the scale being proposed, this wouldn't be a small disruption. It would be a massive, repeated intervention, year after year, into an ecosystem that's already operating on thin margins. And here's the uncomfortable truth that rarely gets said out loud. Even after all of this, it still might not work. Because nothing like this has ever been attempted at this scale. If you want to understand what that risk looks like, you don't have to guess. You can look at Australia. Australia faced its own crisis with invasive species, foxes, feral cats, rabbits. To fight them, scientists used a poison called 1080. It worked because native Australian wildlife had evolved alongside plants that naturally produced similar compounds, making them more resistant. The results were real. Koalas and wallabies began to recover. Predator populations dropped in targeted areas. But there was a cost. Eagles died after feeding on poison carcasses. Native birds, sparrows, parrots, turned out to be vulnerable. Monitor lizards consumed contaminated prey and died. And over time, some rabbits began developing resistance to the poison. The target was adapting. What started as a powerful solution began losing effectiveness. The takeaway isn't that the strategy failed. It's that large-scale ecological interventions never affect only the intended target. Collateral damage isn't an exception. It's part of the system. The real question is always the same. Does the benefit outweigh the harm? And you never fully know that answer ahead of time. If Florida moves forward, it inherits that same dilemma, only in an even more complex ecosystem, and with a public that has already shown how it reacts to controversial solutions. We've seen this before. In the early 2020s, a biotech company called Oxitec got approval to release genetically modified mosquitoes in Florida. The idea was simple: release engineered males whose offspring wouldn't survive, reducing disease-carrying populations without chemicals. The science was strong. In places like the Cayman Islands and Brazil, mosquito numbers dropped dramatically, up to 80 to 95%. But in Florida, the reaction was explosive. The backlash wouldn't come from just one side. It would hit all at once. Scientists would raise serious concerns, and the public would push back just as hard. Unlike the mosquito project, where ecological risks were limited, this strategy carries far deeper consequences. In fact, even experts who want it to succeed struggle to fully support it. So, What is Florida actually doing right now? But here's the reality. None of these methods are ready, none are cheap, and none can operate at the scale this crisis demands. And none are as simple as dropping millions of baited mice from helicopters. What nobody expected is that the Everglades would be the worst possible place for any large-scale solution. Its complexity, its interconnected life systems, these make any intervention unpredictable. That morning, Marcus Reyes dropped 300 baited mice as part of a small, controlled test. When he went home, he had no idea what had happened, no idea what had eaten them, or if it worked at all. Meanwhile, the pythons were still there, hidden, breeding, unstoppable. Somewhere below, a female was coiled around dozens of eggs, perfectly undisturbed. If this strategy fails, and right now, no one knows, Florida is left with a problem that has no clear solution. An invasive predator that can't be hunted fast enough, can't be safely poisoned, and can't yet be controlled. The Everglades is still holding on. But every ecosystem has a limit, and no one knows how close this one is,